Okay, so as I said, in 2014, I became a pro-religious, pro-white nationalist. My whole life before that, I was a communist, anti-white, anti-religious. 2015 became pro-white, or 2016 became, or 2015 I became a communist, anti-religious again. I always saw religion as white supremacist, but then 2016 I became a pro-white nationalist, pro-religion, and then again in 2020 my grandpa kind of confused me. I became a leftist again, and and anti-white, anti-religion, and I'll kind of describe that transition again. So again, my grandpa kind of confused me. So one thing that happened at that time was, as I said, I went to visit my grandpa in Washington, and I was going to live with them. But then my grandpa was like, if you're going to live with me, as I was staying with him, he said, if you're going to live with me, you're going to have to get a job. My grandpa had just moved to Washington from Malibu. As I said, my grandpa, his whole life lived in, or he grew up in I forget where he grew up. He grew up in Ohio. Then he went to New York, got his PhD in then he went to Chicago, became a minister. Then he, at the age of 40, he went to New York, got his PhD in metapsychiatry, existential metapsychiatry, PhD in psychology, transpersonal psychology. Then, and I think he moved to Los Angeles. He worked at the Crystal Cathedral for a little bit as a therapist. Then he went to live in Kauai because my grandma bought a bed and breakfast in Kauai. Then he went to stay with me in high school because I was having problems with my dad because of the shoot-away machine. And then, at the time I didn't know it was a shoot-away machine. And then he ended up staying in Malibu, but then he moved to Washington in like 2019. So I went to move with him and to stay with him in Washington, but my grandpa was like, if you're going to stay with me, you have to get a job. And I was telling my grandpa how I wanted to talk to my mom and dad and see them. I wanted to see them and I wanted to talk to them and I wanted a normal relationship. But my grandpa was like, well, your mom and dad don't want to talk to you because so long as you're dependent on them, you are expressing ally enemy software, because then if they do what you want, then they're your ally. If they don't, then they're your enemy. And, so long as people are, you're dependent on somebody, you're going to resent them. And, and they resent you, and you're going to resent them. And I'm like, that's not true. This whole, your ideas, your ideologies, your philosophies actually created this horrible situation where, they misinterpret it and they're like, oh yeah, we want him to be independent. Let's not talk to him. Let's kick him out. And I'm like, dude, grandpa, but later my grandpa would be like, yeah, it's true. Well, I might have cast pearls of swine and they might have misinterpreted my teachings, but no, he had bad teachings, and he was, he was not helpful. It would have been helpful to have support, to be treated like a normal person. I discovered the theory of everything. He's like, well, you need to get a job. And I was telling him, well, grandpa, I discovered the theory of everything. Can you please help me get this stuff popular? Help support me, get me back in contact with my mom and dad. Maybe they can support me. I discovered the theory of everything. And my grandpa was like, well, you think you deserve respect. You think you deserve respect, and you think that you're entitled to respect. So he was trying to basically insinuate that I'm a narcissist or something. Like, you think you're entitled to respect. And I'm like, no, that's grandpa. That's not what I'm talking about. It's not that I feel entitled. It's that I discovered the theory of everything, and I want to be treated accordingly. I don't want to be treated with disrespect. I don't want to be thrown to the side. And, my mom thinks I'm schizophrenic. My dad threw me to the side, thinks I'm schizophrenic. At that time, they really did think I was schizophrenic. I'm being treated with real disrespect. I would like to talk to them, and I'd like to be treated with some dignity. Later my grandpa would be like, just recently my grandpa was like, well, I admit, Ryan, being treated with respect, no one deserves to be treated with respect. That's self-confirmatory. And, because again, the self is an illusion, and, to want respect, that's self-confirmatory. And, respect is just something that comes if you're in the flow, but, you don't want respect. That's self-confirmatory, and, and the self is an illusion, but it is true that it is helpful to be respected, to be treated with respect. That is true. To be treated with respect is helpful. But I wasn't being treated with respect. So I was like, no, grandpa, I don't feel entitled. I don't feel like I deserve respect. I just want to be treated. I discovered the theory of everything, and right now I'm being treated with a lot of disrespect, and it doesn't have to be that way. But my grandpa didn't believe that I discovered the quadrant model. And again, he's being disrespectful. You didn't discover the quadrant model. I have the theory of everything. Everything is energy. That's my theory of everything. I'm like, no, that's not a theory of everything. That's a new age conjecture. And You know, and then, so this is the other interesting thing. At that time when I was in Washington, I looked on one of my grandpa's shelves, and he had a book called Existential Metapsychiatry by Dr. Hora. And he had a book called Beyond the Dream by Dr. Hora. And I never read them before. So I started reading them. And I started reading them out loud to my grandpa. And this is the first time I ever read it. And like I said, before this, I was very confused because I didn't understand why my grandpa was always like, you know, take responsibility. I just thought he was a white supremacist victim blamer. And, you know, take responsibility, just work hard and everything. And I just thought, and I didn't know it was coming from Dr. Hora. So, you know, I just thought my grandpa was, and also the whole self-confirmatory thing and like all those ideas and stuff, all came from Dr. Hora. So I was just like, you know, I was always confused. But then I started reading the books, and I started, you know, and I was studying existentialism, and I started reading about how Dr. Hora, you know, he's an existentialist, and existentialists think it's important to take responsibility. But Dr. Hora took it to extreme, to where he's like, you know, everything you're creating, like, you know, if there's a storm, you created it with your existentially invalid thoughts. And if, you know, you have a disease, it's not because of bacteria, it's not because of any of that stuff, it's because of your thoughts. Everything is created by your thoughts. Existentially, it's very new age. But my grandpa, like I said, he maintained the new age, take responsibility for everything, but he toned it down because he didn't want to seem like a magical thinker, and he didn't want to seem crazy. So he toned it down to like, well, you know, you don't really create the storm. Well, you can, because everything is energy. Again, like, that's not true. Not everything's energy. And I think that in a way, maybe it's possible if everything is like Dr. Jung, like Carl Jung says, that like everything's a dream. Maybe it's possible that, you know, everything's an illusion, and, you know, magical things can happen in that sense. But my grandpa tried to make it very naturalistic and rationalistic, like, well, everything's energy, and Jesus was one with the energy, so he could manipulate things, and he could affect the storms, you know. But, you know, but that's not really what Dr. Hora taught. Dr. Hora taught everything is like a hologram illusion, and he said everything's the mind of God. Now, when I would read to my grandpa the Christian Scientist stuff, where they talk about everything is mind, my grandpa would be like, yeah, everything is energy. But I'd be like, that's not what they're saying. They're saying everything is mind, everything is consciousness, everything is, as Dr. Hora said, cosmic love, intelligence. It's not energy. It's talking about mind. It's consciousness or something. But my grandpa would be like, I don't understand that. You know, my grandpa thought that consciousness was just an epiphenomenon. He thought that consciousness was an illusion. But that's not what Dr. Hora taught. Dr. Hora said that everything is consciousness. So my grandpa, like, completely, he took Dr. Hora's teachings, but he completely flip it upside down, and he thought that I was stupid because I questioned his idea that everything's energy. But then I'm reading through Dr. Hora's books, and I'm like, Grandpa, Dr. Hora is saying what I said. Like, Dr. Hora seems more valid to me than you. You know, but my grandpa, he tried to make everything like, he tried to maintain the new age thing, like take responsibility for everything. But he'd be like, well, you don't create the storm per se, but, you know, you can choose whether to experience it or not, or be in fear. And, you know, self-confirmatory, you know, anxiety would be self-confirmatory, and you can experience, there can be a storm and you don't have to experience it at all. You know, you could be in the flow and you don't even have to experience it at all. And my grandpa would go so far as to be like, yeah, and if you're in the flow, there's supernatural kind of things, but he wouldn't call it supernatural, but, you know, you could manipulate the energies and, you know, all that type of stuff. So it's like, and again, like, I never liked spiritual people or sort of religious people because I always saw them as white supremacists and victim blamers and all that. And I'll get more to that later. But so I'm just, my grandpa was just kind of confusing me. But as I was staying there with my grandpa, I started reading Dr. Hora's books, and now I'm getting a better idea. So I'm studying how, now I finally, like, before that, I didn't really understand what Dr. Hora taught. And then I start reading the book Existential Metapsychiatry, and I'm like, okay, it's existentialism. And, you know, my grandpa always called it transpersonal psychology, what he was. But okay, so I'm like, okay, existentialism, take responsibility. You know, the reason why they're called existentialists is, you know, and why they believe in like angst is they say you take responsibility for everything. You don't blame God, you don't blame anything, but you take responsibility, and that's supposed to give you angst or whatever. But my grandpa would be, you know, so I'm like, okay, now I'm starting to understand why my grandpa's all into like taking responsibility and stuff. And, you know, my grandpa, again, he would be like, no, there is no separate God, because that would be dualistic software. But, you know, and that would be like self-confirmatory, because then you believe that there's a you and there's a separate God. But no, everything is just energy. And so you don't want to blame God for anything. You don't want to blame genetics. My grandpa, like I said, my grandpa would be like, you know, I asked my grandpa, you know, a lot of people say that diseases come from genetics in big part, like cancer in a lot of ways comes from genetics. And my grandpa would be like, I don't like that idea. It's not existentially valid, because, you know, everything is energy, and I think that, cancer comes because everything is energy, and if you are not in the flow, then, blockages can occur in the energy fields, and that is what cancer is. So if you're not in the flow, so again, it's like blaming the victim, like blaming you. But I didn't like that when I was a communist leftist, because I'm like, no, it's not always, you're not responsible for everything. Like, it could be genetics, but then my grandpa would be like, well, it could be genetics, or it could be a genetic aspect, but I think it's the best and the most existentially valid and leads to the best results to take responsibility for everything. So, you can't do anything about genes, but what you can do is you can upgrade your software. You can upgrade your consciousness, raise your level of consciousness. So, but if you believe in just genes, then you just resign to that. But I'm like, again, though, my grandpa would later be like, if you're in the flow, you can be able to discern the truth. And I don't think that that's necessarily the most the most valid way to look at things, or even the most helpful. I think it could be very harmful and not helpful to take responsibility for everything and to subscribe to my grandpa's teachings and stuff. And I think that I'm an example of that. I think that he fucked shit up with me. Like, he made my family, like, he would say, no, they just misinterpreted. But no, I think his teachings really influenced my family in a very negative way. It made them into like right-winger, really callous, uncompassionate, people to me. And it didn't help me at all. So, but my point is but I'm starting to read Dr. Horowitz books, and I'm reading to my grandpa, but I'm asking my grandpa more questions. And I asked him, like, well, what do you think of the KKK, grandpa? And my grandpa was like, well, it's a concession. Like, there were black people who were acting crazy, and, they got out of slavery and they didn't have education. So my grandpa would be like, it's not them. It's not because they're black. And my grandpa would try to always be so progressive. Like, it's not because they're black. I'm not saying it's because they're black. Like, it's like a huge revelation that he had. And it's like, it's not because they're black, but it's because, because of education and the lack of education and stuff like that, and there were black people who were raping white women and, after slavery, and they didn't have jobs and stuff like that. And so the KKK was a concession. So, but my grandpa also taught that there's no such thing as racism. And I'm going to get to this more. I'm going to get to this more in the next lecture. But my grandpa would be like, there's no such thing as racism. It's just, all there is just different expressions of dualistic software. Because my grandpa would be like, there is no black or white. Jesus said, that there is no slave nor Greek. There is no male nor female. There is no Jew nor Greek. If you're in the flow, you transcend the ego. And really, there is no such thing as racism. There is no black people or white people. What there is there's different expressions of dualistic software, like superior, inferior, predator, prey, ally, enemy, good guy, bad guy. Predator, prey would be impersonal, action oriented. Superior, inferior would be action, or would be not action oriented, would be attitudinal, interpersonal consciousness. And all there is just different expressions of that and the consequences of different levels of software. But there's no such thing as racism. And I'd be like, okay. And and it's kind of interesting, because even like when Dr. Horowitz would kind of taught like there's no such thing as like mental illness. But, he would say, like, we don't diagnose people. What we do is we look at people's mode of being and mode of seeing. And we try to elevate people beyond, existentially invalid thoughts or self-confirmatory ideation and stuff. So my grandpa would be like, yeah, it's never the person. That person is not a bipolar person. That's labeling. And when you label, then you don't see the whole picture. You don't see what the person really is, which there's some validity to that, but also labeling can help in ways. But, he's like, you don't see the whole picture. So, what instead of labeling, what the best thing to do is to just, to see that the person is not their software, and people can upgrade their software, and people can you are not your software. You are not. And see people not as their software, and all that type of stuff. So anyways, so I'm learning more from my grandpa. I'm starting to get a better idea of what existential metapsychiatry is, and I'm starting to understand the whole existentialist part, and also all that type of stuff. But like I said, at that time I liked Donald Trump because I had become a right winger. And before I didn't like existential metapsychiatry or my grandpa's transpersonal psychology teachings, because I was like, they're spiritual and they're kind of religious. And to me, it was still white supremacist, and it was still like Nazi-like. And I always saw spirituality and religion as like white supremacist. and maintaining the status quo, and especially like that whole like take responsibility for everything, or that like the secret stuff, like, oh, you create your reality. I always thought that was like white supremacist, because it's like blaming the victim. And one thing I didn't like about religion, and I'll get to this in the next lecture, is like I thought that a big thing that would occur with religious people is they would be like, oh, for instance, like the Jews, like the Jews were, the Jews were taken down by the Babylonians. It was because of their sin. God is just, and if bad things happen to you, it must be because of your sin, because God is just. And I always thought it was victim blaming oriented, but my grandpa took it to the next extreme in Dr. Horror, where it's like, yeah, your existentially invalid thoughts brought upon your destruction, and again, like, there is always an element of blame that people have. Like, yes, it is true, victims are not always innocent, and that was a big thing by Dr. Horror. Like, there is no innocent victims, and my grandpa too. My grandpa would be like, there is no innocent victims, but there's always degrees to it, But my grandpa, he's more sophisticated. He would acknowledge like someone who's like, oh yeah, that woman deserved being raped. That could be an expression of predator-prey software, my grandpa would say, and it could be self-confirmatory, and there's levels and degrees of it. But regardless, at the time, I'm just confused. My grandpa's confusing me, right? But I was still a right-winger at this time. This is 2020. But as I said, my grandpa and I kind of got in an argument, because I'm telling my grandpa, I want to talk to my mom and dad. I want to see my mom and dad. And my grandpa's like, well, your mom and dad don't want to see you because you're dependent on them, and they resent you for that, and you resent them because you're dependent on them. And until you become independent and you have a job and you're no longer dependent on them, they're not going to want to talk to you, because that's just